Okay, well, I think we have a good number of people who have joined into the webinar. So let me start by just introducing myself. So my name is Paul Stewart. I'm the Global Coffee Director at TechnoServe, and I'm going to be moderating today's webinar. I'm joined by several expert presenters and panelists. The opening remarks are going to be given by Ato Ficado de Ferres. Ato Ficado is the Partners Linkage Team Leader at the Ethiopian Coffee and Tea Authority. We'll then have a short presentation from one of our partners, Fikr Tadesse, and Fikr is the Regional Program Manager at Partnership for Forests, a UK government-funded program. We then are going to have a presentation from my colleague, Catherine Mussangi, who is the Senior Program Manager for TechnoServe's coffee programs in Ethiopia. And our final presentation will be given by our good friend, Dr. Aaron Davis. Aaron is the Senior Research Leader of Plant Resources at Kew Royal Botanical Gardens in London. And I'm really excited to hear Aaron's presentation about Ethiopian forests, and I'm sure he'll be touching on the topic of climate change, which he's published some super interesting papers in the past few years and its effect on Ethiopia's forest coffees. We will finally, after the opening presentations, we're going to have a panel discussion. So this will be your chance to send in your questions. So throughout the presentations, please feel free to, in the chat box, to write any questions that you have for any of the presenters. We'll also be joined on that panel by Conrad Britz, who is the founder and CEO of Falcon Coffee. And Conrad has a lot of experience trading Ethiopia's forest coffees. He knows the place very well and has been very involved in promoting Ethiopia's forest coffees, particularly in Europe and in other parts of the world. So please do write your questions in the chat box at any time. And when we should have a good amount of time at the end of the 1 hour to go through your questions. So to kick us off, we have a couple of poll questions just to test your knowledge on Ethiopian forest coffee. So our first poll question is, what proportion of coffee produced in Ethiopia comes from forest or semi-forested landscapes? Is it A, 70%, B, 50%, C, 30%, or D, 10%? The 70% is correct. Now, it does depend a little bit how you define forest and semi-forest coffee, but if we include within that definition the forest garden coffee, then it represents at least 70% of Ethiopia's coffee. So it's a huge proportion. The vast majority of Ethiopia's coffee can be classed as forest grown coffee. Let's take a look at our second poll question. What are the environmental benefits of forest and semi-forest coffee? Is it A, reduces land degradation, B, increases biodiversity, C, stores carbon, or D, all of the above? All right, and 80% of you got it right. The answer is, of course, D, that it is all of the above. Great. Well, that was just a fun little way to get us started. I'm now going to ask our good friend, Ato Ficado, who represents the Ethiopian Coffee and Tea Authority with us today. And I'm going to ask Ato Ficado to bring us a few opening remarks from the Ethiopian government for today's event. Thank you, Ato Ficado.
Thank you. Distinguished participants, invited guests, on behalf of Ethiopian Coffee and the Tea Authority, let me express my warm welcome to you to this virtual launch of Ethiopian forest coffee. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Fakadu Daferres. I'm the Partners Linkage Team Leader at the Ethiopian Coffee and Tea Authority. On behalf of the authority, it is my pleasure to be here with you today, and would like to welcome you to the launch of Ethiopian Forest Coffee Illustrated Guide event. As many of you know, coffee is the #1 export commodity for our country, and the government of Ethiopia is working on improving coffee industry as one of its priority foreign currency generating sector of the country. The government of Ethiopia has made significant policy reforms in the Ethiopian coffee industry to increase production and productivity, improve quality of coffee while maintaining the traceability of exported coffee, and introducing alternative coffee marketing options, such as allowing exports on the option of direct purchase from supplier or farmers, allowing small scale producers direct export, and other marketing options outside of the Ethiopian Commodity Exchange. The Ethiopian Forest Coffee Project, led by Partnerships for Forests with funding from the United Kingdom's Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, came at a critical time as we were looking for partners with a vision of growing the Ethiopian coffee industry. Since 2016, Ethiopian Coffee and the Tea Authority and the Partnerships for Forests have worked together on developing and ensuring quality implementation of the Ethiopian Forest Coffee Project. The project aims at improving the quality of forest coffee so that it fetches higher price, thereby incentivizing forest adjacent communities to protect forests from the deforestation and degradation. This guide is part of the ongoing work to boost demand for this high-quality forest coffee throughout the world by promoting and supporting the creation of the international Ethiopian Forest Coffee brands. The Ethiopian Coffee and Tea Authority reiterates its enthusiasm for the project and would like to thank you all for your continued interest and support. We look forward to working hard in hand with our partners to strengthen Ethiopia's coffee industry and bring Ethiopian forest coffee to the world. Finally, I would like to say this virtual meeting is officially opened. Thank you again for your time. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Dr. Fakado, for those opening words and for welcoming us all together. I'm now going to ask our colleague and friend, Fikr, Partnership for Forests, to tell us a little bit about the Partnerships for Forests program and its work in Ethiopia, just to help us understand where this all came from. So thank you, Fikr.
Great. Thanks, Paul. Just give it a minute for the slides to come on the screen. So maybe while we wait for the slides, thanks again, Paul, for the introduction. I thought I would kick us off with a brief overview of the Partnerships for Forests program and a quick introduction to the Ethiopian Forest Coffee Project. Partnerships for Forests is an 8-year UK government-funded global program, and the aim of this program is to catalyze investments into forests and sustainable land use globally. We operate in 4 regions globally across the tropical belt in East Africa, West and Central Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America. The program has a clearly defined objective, which is to catalyze investments into forests and sustainable land use by supporting what we refer to as forest partnerships through grants and technical assistance. We do this by supporting activities that could build value chains of forest commodities and strengthen demand for sustainable commodities. We support partnerships between private sector companies, public sector actors, and communities, and support these partnerships with the design, piloting, and scaling of businesses that generate better returns from forests and sustainable land use than they otherwise would from deforestation and degradation. We also support initiatives that unblock critical barriers in the enabling environment space that hinder sustainable investments into forests. In East Africa, we have found that deforestation is primarily driven by smallholder encroachment into forests, mainly for two things, agriculture and wood fuel. Therefore, our projects in East Africa focus on increasing the value of non-timber forest products, of which a great example is actually the Ethiopian forest coffee project that we'll be talking about today. We also work on sustainable timber and sustainable land use for agriculture. Next slide, please. So just to set the context on why we chose to work on Ethiopian forest coffee, Ethiopia's Arabica coffee is actually quite unique as it grows wild in the forests of Ethiopia. And though the forests contain significant value as hosts of these unique coffee genetic varieties, they are still very much under threat. So currently, nearly half of Ethiopia's coffee production comes from forests and semi-forest areas, which kind of presented us with an excellent opportunity to address deforestation by helping transform the forest coffee value chain from a subpar quality product to a specialty export quality commodity that can be sold at premium prices, thereby incentivizing smallholders living around these forests to protect these valuable natural resources. The project operates across 5 forest regions in Ethiopia, covering around 150,000 hectares. Next slide, please. So what is our vision for this project? The Ethiopian Wild Forest Coffee Project will improve the forest coffee value chain, as I mentioned. It will improve farmers' livelihoods, and it will also strengthen community forest management. We aim to achieve these goals by exporting higher quality of Ethiopian forest coffee, galvanizing millions in private sector investments, secure off-takers that buy at prices which incentivize farmers to protect 150,000 hectares of these standing forests. We'll also help develop an internationally recognized brand of Ethiopian forest coffee. Next slide, please. So to help us realize this vision, we are working with TechnoServe and GIZ with the support and guidance of the Ethiopian Coffee and Tea Authority. GIZ is working with communities to improve the forest supply chain by providing training to farmers on best practices, developing the necessary processing facilities to handle the bean for highest quality, ensuring food traceability, as well as improving aggregation mechanisms and market penetration. TechnoServe is leading on the branding and marketing component of the project by creating a map of the Ethiopian coffee growing forests, along with grower stories and coffee profiles, which is actually the topic of discussion today. They'll also support the registration of coffee forests as new geographic origins with local authorities, and promote the Ethiopian forest coffee brand globally. So I hope that was useful context. Paul, over to you.
Thank you very much, Fikir. That was great, and that really sets the scene, helping us to understand how this project got started. I'm going to ask our next presenter to tell us a little bit more about the work that was done to put together this great illustrated guide of Ethiopia's forest coffee. So my colleague, Catherine Mussangi, is going to tell us a bit more about what's been going on over the last couple of years to put this together. So Catherine, over to you.
Yes, thank you very much, Paul. And yeah, just picking up from where Paul and Fikir have explained, I'm not going to talk a lot about what forest coffee is or what it all entails, because we've already talked about. As you can see from the slide that is just showing, forest coffee is basically coffee that grows in the wild with actually zero human interference. And then we also have semi-forest coffee. Semi-forest coffee has a bit of human interference, whereby farmers and communities go in to manage their coffee. And the coffee still grows in the forest, but the communities work on it. So why are we raising awareness about the forest coffees? As most of you might know, these coffees are produced by communities that live in the forest, but still there's a bit of lack of awareness on the importance of what the forests and the coffees that grow there interact, on the importance of the genetic bank of thousands of coffee varietals, especially Arabica, that exists in there, and the importance of protecting this biodiversity. So there's lack of awareness of that amongst the forest communities that live there. Now, when it comes to the buyers of these coffees, often it is not very clear where these coffees are coming from and how these coffees interact with the forests where they've come from. Now, when it goes to the consumers who consume this coffee, it's the same thing. In most cases, they are not aware of the existence of the forests where these coffees have come from, and especially in Ethiopia. So you find a lot of coffee comes from the western and the southern parts of Ethiopia. But even with that, the consumer who is taking this coffee does not exactly understand where it came from and how it is raised and the communities that live in there. So building strong coffee brands would help a lot in telling the world about these coffees. But at the same time, when you have a strong forest coffee brand, then that means the farmers or the communities who harvest this coffee have an increased or a better income. What does that mean? If they have a better income, then they are more incentivized to take care of the forests, to conserve the forest and the biodiversity that lies in there. So we have been working towards supporting the creation of forest coffee brands in the last couple of years. And we have been doing this through various ways. So in the last 2-3 years, we have collected over 700 samples of coffee from washed coffee and natural coffees in different parts of the country. And we have also capped over 500 samples of these coffees. Now, during the capping of these samples, we have involved the experts from Ethiopia. So we have capped these coffees with support from the Ethiopian Coffee and Tea Authority, where Fikadu comes from, Fikadu comes from. We have also involved the capping and liquoring unit of the Ethiopian Commodity Exchange. And we have also involved experts from the private entities and even some of the coffee buyers, all for them to appreciate these coffees and where they come from and the communities that grow these coffees. And so as a result of this capping and all this work, we have come up with profiles, with profiles from different parts of Ethiopia, mostly from Bale, from Ilubabo, from Jima, and other parts of the country, for those who are familiar with Ethiopia. And besides just capping the coffees, we have also mapped all these areas. So, and today we are presenting to you an illustrative guide that basically has put together all this. So this illustrative guide that we are launching and we're talking to you about today represents over 78 mills and and groups that produce this coffee. It tells their stories about the communities that produce this coffee, and it also tells about the coffee itself. How does it taste like? What are the flavors that come from this forest? A very good example that I'm going to share with you today is coffees from Bale. Bale is the home of the Bale Mountains and also Bale National Park. And Bale hosts a very extensive forest called Arena Forest. And these forests, basically the communities that live around here have survived on this forest in terms of harvesting coffee from the forest and also honey and other products from the forest. It is the source of income for these farmers. And as one of the farmers from this area, I remember him telling us that, you know, forests can live without us, but we cannot live without the forest. So that emphasizes on the need to conserve this forest and on the need to build strong brands that at the end of the day would benefit the farmers in form of income. And in Bale, we also find farmers like Taye. Taye is a farmer who will tell you that his parents and himself, they have relied on this forest for coffee and for honey. Not only for their source of income, but also for their cultural practices. So they use coffee when they're celebrating birth of a child. They use coffee when they are resolving conflicts. They use coffee, you know, when they're celebrating any form of ceremony. And they also use coffee as medicine. So this tells you that there's really rich cultural and association and connection between coffee and the communities that live in these areas. So this guide will give you such stories. It will also show you the cooperatives and the private mills and the participatory management groups that have been featured, the areas that have been featured, where the coffee comes from, and how the coffee tastes. So every page of this book gives you a story, gives you names of the cooperatives that are found here. So as you peruse through it, you will be able to learn a lot about the Ethiopian forest coffees. And yeah, just next slide, please. So I am sure you all received a link that directs you to a landing page where you will find more information about these coffees. So when you look at that link, there's one part that talks about downloading the guide. So you will click on the download the guide to download. And then there's also another section that talks about interactive maps. So we have produced these cool maps that are very interactive that will tell you about each of the forest areas that we have described and what type of coffee comes from there. So for example, when you go to Bale, you will find that there's a lot of areas and mills that are found in the forest. So the green shaded area is protected forest of the Ethiopian forest coffees. So when you click there, for example, if you want to find out one of the mills, you click in one of the mills, and it will tell you what type of coffees are found there, whether they are washed coffees or natural coffees that were capped, and the altitude of the area, the coffee tastes, how it tastes, and all that. So I hope as you go through the guide and the interactive maps, you will enjoy the different types of coffees that are found in Ethiopia. And yeah, in the next time you buy coffee, you will consider buying coffee from one of those areas that we have featured. So thank you very much, and over to you, Paul.
Great, thank you so much, Catherine. That was really super. And we're going to go to our final presentation before our question and answer session. And this presentation is going to be given by our good friend, Dr. Aaron Davis. Aaron actually was the key author of another great book. In fact, I even have a copy right here, so I'll even promote it here, The Coffee Atlas of Ethiopia, which has a lot of really amazing technical information about coffees. This guide we're launching today is a little bit different. We're telling the stories and going into a lot more detail around the cuppings. I think they're really complementary books if you want to know everything there is to know about Ethiopia's forest coffees. So let me hand over to Aaron.
Thank you very much, Paul. I'll jump straight into the slides. I'll just put them on the. There we go. Sorry, just go back. Yeah, thank you very much, Paul. So, firstly, I'd just like to take a slight historical back step in terms of the significance of Ethiopian coffee. Most of us know this information already, of course, but Ethiopia is the birthplace of coffee. It's where coffee drinking started in connection with Yemen and the Arab world. And just as importantly, it's the natural home of Arabica coffee. It's where it's found in the wild. It's the only place it's found in the wild apart from a small area on the Boma Plateau in South Sudan. Now, if you look at this map here, you'll see the green areas, and that gives you some indication of where wild coffee occurs in Ethiopia. Now, coffee is exceptionally important to the Ethiopian economy, of course, around 15 million people involved in the coffee sector, and it's providing around 25 to 30% of export earnings and ranks as the world's 5th largest exporter. So I guess the big question here for purchasers, roasters, and consumers, coffee drinkers, why Ethiopian coffee? And I hope to sort of cover that question in the next few minutes. Now, we've already heard a lot this afternoon about the diversity of flavor profiles. And for me, this really is the USP of Ethiopian coffee. Now, if we look at the coffee cultivation landscape, the coffee farming landscape of Ethiopia, we can see it's much bigger than the wild forest area and is extended into areas that are perhaps more dry or perhaps less sort of forest-like than those wild areas. But in essence, most of Ethiopia's coffee production comes from forests. I think the other key thing to say is that Ethiopia is a big country. If you were to compare it, for example, to Central America, you could squeeze pretty much all of Central America into Ethiopia. It's a very big country, and I think a lot of people aren't aware of that. And then there's also the fact that there are a huge diversity of different environments. This just shows the rainfall profile, but it's that combination of environmental variance and the genetic diversity that comes from those wild forests that gives Ethiopia that, as I say, USP and translates into those wonderful flavor profiles. Now, a few years ago, we produced the Coffee Atlas of Ethiopia, which maps out in great detail the forests, the wild forests, the coffee suitability, and also what that suitability would look like across this century in terms of climate change. And it provides a very useful platform for understanding, where coffee could be grown over the next several decades. But what we also did was to look at coffee origins, the coffee towns, across the complete landscape of Ethiopia, to try and, just like we're talking about today, to try and promote, make people aware of the rich diversity of Ethiopian coffee. Now, we cupped a fair amount of coffee during that process, traveling around Ethiopia, and two things were very, very clear. One, that there are huge diversity of flavor profiles, but secondly, that I think we're only at the beginning of really understanding what that flavor diversity looks like. As I say, this was published in the Coffee Atlas, which Paul's already mentioned, and I'm absolutely delighted to see this being elaborated and enlarged on scale. So there's now much more information about those flavor profiles, which that should really excite anybody interested in coffee. But I want to really touch on another key aspect, which has also been discussed this afternoon, and that's the biodiversity component. But what I want to do is link that into the value chain and look at the importance of the value chain in this equation. Now, if you talk to Ethiopian academics, they will tell you quite clearly that if it wasn't for coffee, there wouldn't be much rainforest left in Ethiopia. Coffee production has served to preserve a lot of that forest because of the intrinsic value, because it's useful to produce coffee, but also because it's useful for the other non-timber forest products we've been looking at this afternoon. So a few years ago, we decided to really take a deep dive into this and to see what it actually looked like on the ground by working with communities. And I think it's important to look at this from different perspectives. Here we are looking at a coffee production system. In the background, you can see the coffee under the canopy of those indigenous shade species, and there's a huge amount of important biodiversity even in the coffee production systems. In the foreground, of course, is a coffee nursery. But you take somewhere like Yayu in Ilobobor, and that's the Yayu Biosphere Reserve, coffee generates up to 70% of the cash income for over 90% of the population. So it's extremely important. Now, if you're looking at that landscape from a different perspective, looking across that landscape onto it, it's not the area in the foreground, it's the area in the background that's producing the coffee. And I think that surprises a lot of people who are unaware of Ethiopian coffee. Looking at that from above, from satellite imagery, those yellow pins are actually coffee gardens. They are farms. And yet, from satellite imagery, they look like forest. And really, that is almost unique to Ethiopia. Now, what we wanted to do was to try and put some sort of science or some metrics or some measurement behind that. So we used various range of satellite imagery techniques to understand the sort of the characteristics of that forest. So we looked at forest cover and we looked at forest quality, spectral quality. And indeed, what we found was that those coffee forests producing the coffee had a cover and a spectral quality that was almost the same as the main reserve itself. So that's the untouched forest. So it's clear that it has a really positive forest cover value and, of course, associated biodiversity benefits. And that's why we were able to brand the product of this project, which was a forest coffee, and then sort of put the story behind that as to why we were interested in producing this coffee. Of course, it's got a fantastic taste. It has a very high cupping score, and it's selling very well in UK supermarkets. But I think it's the human side of this, the people perspective, is really critical. When we started the project in Yayu, it was very, very clear that the local stakeholders were utterly aware of the value of the forest. The unfortunate thing was that although they had fair trade certification and organic certification and Forest Alliance certification, they weren't actually selling their coffee, or they weren't realizing the value of their coffee. And this had an important implication in the fact that they said to us, although we want the forest and we value the forest, if it's not going to make us support our livelihoods, then we have to convert to something else that probably won't be using forest. So there's a real critical risk there. So a few take-homes from this project, and I think they're very germane to this afternoon's discussion, is that across the 950 households that we surveyed, if those farmers were engaged in only 25% specialty coffee, their income increased by 30%. So that's not an academic exercise, that's a value chain exercise. That's actually what happened. If they were to invest 100% in specialty coffee, then they could double their income from coffee. And that's hugely significant. We've mentioned the value chain this afternoon, and that's a really important point. Further increases in profitability can come from making sure all the elements of the value chain are linked up and working properly. So what does that look like in terms of environmental outcomes? Well, as I've said, a large proportion of those farms retain a level of forest and quality that is similar to undisturbed forest. So it's going to have a high biodiversity value. The other thing to note is that when we looked at deforestation over the last 20 years, there's been insignificant deforestation, almost zero deforestation. And that, I think it's a really key point, is that what those Ethiopian academics were saying is absolutely true. The other important thing is that there's been no increase in land use. So the value is added by the value from the coffee, by going from sort of commodity level coffee up to specialty coffee. And there was no extra increase in fertilizer, etc. It was just the value in the coffee itself. Now, again, something else has been mentioned. Yayu Forest, of course, we're working in the outer areas of the reserve, but inside the reserve, which is the reason, you know, for having the buffer and the other zones, is that we want to make sure that the internal, the absolutely undisturbed areas of the forest are preserved, because within those areas are these massive gene pools of wild diversity for Arabica coffee, which is so important for long-term sustainability of the sector in Ethiopia. I think the other thing to add is that it's not just about biodiversity. There's also the ecosystem services side of things. So, you know, forest provides homes for pollinators. Pollination services are important for productivity, including coffee. And then there's also things like water and nutrient recycling, but also climate amelioration. I mean, forests play a very important part in softening climatic impacts, weather impacts, but also things reducing air temperatures and improving soil moisture, etc. And then there's all the other things that come along as well, such as carbon capture. And it's not just in the trees, of course. A lot of the carbon capture occurs in the soil, and the value of that soil capture wouldn't be the same if the forest wasn't there. So all in all, you know, incredibly important. So I hope that's given you some sort of overview of my feeling on the value of Ethiopian forest coffee, and why it's, you know, so exciting for the buyer, the roaster, or the consumer. I think the other thing that I would just quickly add is that as legislation moves forward, what I see is an increasing desire to add metrics to forest coffees. So you know, I think Ethiopia is unique in the fact that it can actually provide figures on the amount of forest that's being conserved, and the quality of the forest is being conserved. And I think that's something that really needs to be capitalized on. Okay, thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much, Aaron. And yeah, that's a lot for us to think about. And I have a few questions myself, but I'm sure many of our participants have great questions. So I want to give them the chance to ask their questions. So we're going to be kicking off our Q&A session, and we're going to have, yeah, all our speakers are going to be available to answer questions. As I mentioned earlier, we have an additional person who's going to join the panel, a good friend of ours, Conrad Britz, who's the CEO of Falcon Coffees. And Conrad has a lot of experience. So my first question to you is, what was your first impression as a coffee buyer when you first stepped into a coffee forest in Ethiopia?
Yeah, I was chatting to Aaron earlier this week, and I started talking about forest coffee, and when he responded, his opening remark was, but Ethiopia is such an incredible place, such an incredible country. And I thought that's a really good thing to take into the context of this conversation. It is, as a visitor to Ethiopia, it is this ancient and rich culture. And when you leave when you leave Addis and you travel to the rural regions, you really get a sense of that history. To me, it felt almost sort of biblical, and I know there are strong biblical stories attached to parts of Ethiopia. I think when I thought about visiting the mother forest of coffee, it was more of an intellectual exercise, maybe sort of slightly flippant to some degree. It was one of those things on my coffee bucket list to do, and so it was going to be great, almost like visiting the equator, and you could get your photo taken in I did that on the Congo-Ugandan border. So I wasn't really prepared for the impact of entering the forest, and a tropical rainforest is a living thing. It doesn't just contain living things, and it is a sensory overload of sound and life and smell and temperature. And the coffee was, I hadn't really thought about it. What would the coffee look like? But it was like no other coffee tree I'd seen anywhere in the world. It was sort of almost vine-like and twisted, covered in lichen and moss. And I suppose the realization was this has always been here. Probably is more ancient than the humans themselves. And so, there's a mystical element to that experience. What I've thought about since then is the incredible success of this species. It's pretty much traversed the tropics of the entire globe. And I've recently read a book by Merlin Sheldrake, which is about the fungal kingdom, called Entangled Life, and the very first chapter is about truffles, and there's a connection to coffee. And the chapter is titled Allure, and the subtext is a lyric from a Prince song, and it says, the lyric is, "Who's pimping who?" And he explains in this chapter that truffles are the fruiting body, of a type of fungus, but they're unlike mushrooms that pop up through the earth to release their spores. Truffles are underground, so they've developed a very different and sophisticated mechanism to disperse their spores, and they create these clouds of molecules that are olfactory molecules which seep out into the soil and then into the air, and they're very purposely constructed to be irresistible to certain animals, rodents, pigs, dogs, probably a string of wild animals, and of course humans. And it's through our scrambling, because the moment you pick them, the taste starts to degrade, they're dying, and we air freight them all over the world to get them to the top restaurants, and so really we propagate. And it feels like coffee's done the same. You have the seed that, apart from the stimulant, the caffeine, is through that chemical process of heating, there is this flavor detonation. And for a non-essential food crop, the success of coffee as a species, and also how many millions of households around the world have coffee as the center of their household economy, it's an incredible success story. So, who's pimping who?
Excellent. And my second question to you, Conrad, before we open up the floor, is have you seen the market develop for these semi-forest coffees from Ethiopia over the recent years?
Yes. I'm not sure it's specifically because of that designation, but certainly when we started working together at TechnoServe and Falcon in 2009, so TechnoServe's remit from the Gates Foundation, I think, was to double the household income of smallholder farmers. And in Ethiopia, the focus was on Limujima because these are discounted coffees compared to coffees from the south, the more famous Yerkechev and Sidama coffees. And as Falcon, we stood as financial guarantor for about 115,000 smallholder farmers in that region who were accessing credit for the first time, and with TechnoServe's help, built eco-pulpers and washing stations. And the impact of that work was that through training and infrastructure, these farmers took some of the most discounted coffees that were exported from Ethiopia. And in that very first year, I think won first, third, and fifth place in the national Taste of Harvest, which has just never been done before. So through the training and the infrastructure and the market access, sort of all enabled by TechnoServe, is these coffees are some of the most famous names today: Doromina, Ukro, Nanachalo. And for me personally, probably the most enduring success story in terms of retained impact. So a huge amount of success, and that union of cooperatives who we still work with all these years later is probably arguably one of the most successful unions in the origin.
Great, thank you very much, Conrad. And okay, so we have about 10 minutes left for other participants to ask the questions. I have a few questions here. So let me start with one for Catherine. I think will be the best person. So let's see if we can get Catherine back. All right, Catherine. So here's a question that I think you're the best person to answer. So do the forest coffees, do their production level, can it be the same in the long term as other smallholder coffee farms in Ethiopia?
Yeah, good question. So coffee that grows in the forest is obviously not as advantaged as the coffee that grows out in the garden. One, because the shade is quite a lot. So with the overshaded coffee, the trees will be beautiful. They will have very good leaves and everything, but the production will be not as much as it is. But that said, we talked about semi-forest coffee, and semi-forest coffee is coffee that grows still in the forest with managed shade, not as much as what is found in the deep forest, in the wild, and they really cannot compete. The semi-forest coffee or coffee that is managed by smallholder farmers would produce more because there's pruning, there's thinning, and there's a bit of sun that comes in, while the one that is in the wild will not have as much, even though the capping experts will tell you that the longer it stays, the more it becomes in terms of full body and all that, but the volumes would not really be comparable.
Great. And compared to the the garden coffee, which is growing without any shade, which is very little in Ethiopia, but comparing those kind of those garden coffees compared to the semi-forest coffees, what do you see as kind of productivity difference between those?
Garden coffees, because of okay, let me give an example of a place like West Guji, Bulehora, where there's semi-forests, coffee grows under shade. You find that the production is much better compared to some farms that would probably be found in a place like, say, Sidama, where there is totally no shade. We have farmers who have no shade at all, like they've cut all the trees and the coffee is there. Yes, they will still have production, but coffee growing under shade of at least 40%, 50% would produce much better than 100% garden coffee, unless the garden coffee is using fertilizers and all that. And we know, apart from estates, smallholder farmers only use compost and manure. They do not use any inorganic fertilizers at all. So without shade, it is a disadvantage.
Great. Thanks, Catherine. That's a great, it's a really great point that forest coffee is not only the best for coffee for the environment, but it's also the most profitable for farmers. I have another question, which actually I'll ask Ato Ficado if he's able to answer this one. This could be a tough question, so see if anybody else actually on the call might be able to help Ato Ficado. But the question is, has the government of Ethiopia developed payments for ecosystem services for forest coffee? So are there any schemes to make payments for ecosystem services to farmers who are growing forest coffee to reward them for protecting the forest? So Ato Ficado, are you able to answer that question? If not, we can open it up to others. Okay, I think we're having some technical problems there. Anybody else able to answer that question? Anybody know if
Shall I continue?
payments
I think
ecosystem?
I can try a bit of it as we wait for Ato Ficado. So in some parts of the country, especially in the Western, we have these participatory forest management groups that have been formed mainly with the effort of the government. And these groups consist of farmers who harvest coffee from the forest, and they aggregate the coffees together, and the coffee is processed together. And if the coffee is of better quality, of course, they channel it through cooperatives and through unions. And some of the areas, especially in Lubabo, some of the cooperatives pay a little bit better for the forest coffees, and that depends on the cap of the coffee. But yes, there are the participatory forest management groups that have been formed mainly to support with trainings on forest conservation, on the importance of biodiversity, but at the same time to sensitize farmers on the benefits that they could get, not only from coffee, but even other non-timber products from the forest like honey and such.
Great. Thanks, Catherine. And yeah, so yeah, it sounds like there are certainly some premiums that farmers can get for selling forest coffee. And Aaron even mentioned the Yayu coffee, which is getting a premium. But in terms of the actual payments for ecosystem services, so specifically just paying farmers to protect the forest, I don't think I'm certainly not aware of any schemes of that kind in Ethiopia. Great. Here's a question, I think, for Conrad. Conrad, I think you're best placed to answer this. So the question is, what role does the private sector play in promoting forest coffee? And should the private sector be focusing its sourcing on forest coffees?
So the private sector should definitely get involved, and I think that's likely to be driven out of the rising conversation. I've used the acronym ESG because it seems to be sort of the corporate world is talking about as a structure, environment, social, and governance. And so within that environmental piece and looking at carbon sequestration and mitigation and supply chain, forest coffee has a really unique value proposition. So that's very important. I think the private sector is swamped with different kinds of certification and verification schemes and names. And so to distinguish in a marketable soundbite what forest coffee actually stands for, means, and does, I think is a challenge. Again, Aaron and I were speaking earlier this week. I think that these coffees, and I was excited to hear Aaron say that, is their quality is defined, in part by the fact that they grow in the forest. And what you do see is the specialty market is one of the biggest growth sectors in coffee, and these are truly, truly fantastic coffees. So raising the awareness through quality and price premium.
Excellent. And there's actually a great kind of follow-up question for you here, Conrad. This is a tough one. What percentage of global coffee consumption is supplied by forest coffees?
it would be fractional. If the world produces, we talk about 60 kilogram bags, so 150, 160 million. If Ethiopia is producing 7 million bags, of which 50% of the 3, so Ethiopia alone is probably in the region of 1.5%. I'm not sure through countries like Peru, Colombia, and possibly Costa Rica. I'm not familiar with Asia. Not a great percentage. The general philosophy is yield increases with improved sunlight, so forest is denuded.
Yep, great. And we have time just for one more question. This one's for you, Aaron. Can forest coffee gain certification for carbon neutrality?
Yeah, so I think the certification issue is something that really needs to be addressed. And the countries like the ones you mentioned and Ethiopia have, I think that's where they have some potential for real traction. Certification, it doesn't do what it says it does. I think that we're moving into a new era where we have the technology to put metrics, figures on what each farm is doing for the environment. And quite simply, and I see the push coming from the consumer. The consumers wants to make purchasing choices that either don't cause deforestation or preserve and enhance biodiversity. And we've got the legislation side of things. Both require a change in the certification system for products like forest coffee, without doubt. So you cannot have, for example, you cannot compare a forest in Ethiopia with 60% for canopy cover with indigenous trees with a so-called forest or agroforestry system in, say, Brazil that has 5 trees per hectare. The consumer has to understand what they're doing when they buy a bag of coffee, and increasingly they want to know, and increasingly supermarkets will have to show the world that they're not causing deforestation, biodiversity loss. So yeah, I see all sorts of I see huge potential in improving this system with the view of improving ecosystem services, biodiversity, carbon capture, etc. And I think it's something that has to come.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I think that's a great place just to end today's session. And it's many more questions, I think, around the future of Ethiopia's forest coffee, how to protect it, how to reward farmers even more. But I think this event today has, I hope, triggered a few thoughts. And feel free, anyone who has joined us today, to reach out to any of us, the participants today, if you have any additional questions or you want to follow up on any of the topics that we've touched on. Thank you to all of the presenters and panelists for joining me today. I really appreciate you guys taking time out today. Thank you for everyone who joined the webinar to listen in, and I wish you a great rest of the day and a great weekend. So thank you very much, everyone. Bye-bye.
Okay, thank you.